To access the Physics Lab app after you install it, it should be on your home screen. If you're unable to find it there, you're going to want to scroll to the right, then go to where this box where utilities are located, and then you can click on the Physics Lab app. So once you're in here, you're going to see six different tabs that you can open. We are only going to be studying the accelerometer and magnetometer features of the Physics Lab app, and that is what our analysis is going to focus on. If you want to give the app a review afterwards, you can click this icon, and it'll give you other specifications as well as a link to your app. But we're not going to do that right now. So one thing I would recommend is if you just click on accelerometer right now, it's going to give you an ad.
Got a song stuck in your head?
Wait this ad
Download
out,
the Google app to figure out what it is.
Close it after 5 seconds. But I don't like facing ads, so what I recommend is closing the app, swiping up on your phone, entering airplane mode, and then reopen the app, and now you shouldn't encounter ads throughout the app. So looking at the accelerometer, we're going to see that, let me place my phone down, we have 3 different lines. So each line is going to represent different directions. So the Z direction is going to be vertically, and the X and Y directions are going to be horizontally, and the other horizontal, and just like the XY plane of movement. So we can see that the X-axis is always going to be time, and the Y-axis is going to be meters per second squared as expected, because the accelerometer measures acceleration. You can click this button for more information on the accelerometer app. We see that the Z is at a default 9.81 because that is the Earth's gravity, and we are constantly, having that acceleration done to us. However, if we don't want that to be included and we want to measure the acceleration as relative to us on Earth, we can uncheck this box and it will immediately drop that down. So now what we're also going to see is when we have that red line go off the graph, we're actually going to rescale the graph automatically, so we're able to see the minute details. So another feature that exists is you can press the start recording button here if you want to keep track of the data which you collect. And then when you want that to end, you can press it again, and it's going to save it to an Excel file. So, moving back to the magnetometer, this again, X-axis is time, Y-axis is this time going to be microteslas. So here we have the accelerometer app open, and I have include gravity turned off just so we can better see the scaling. So with accelerometers, it's pretty hard to estimate values or understand what this means just with the human eye without doing any data analysis, just because the second derivative is often hard for us to imagine. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to pick the phone up, which should only move the Z at least to the maximum capacity, just so we can see that this is working. So if I just pull this up, we see that the biggest spike is in the red, which is our vertical movement. So there we go. Here I have the magnetometer app open on the Physics Labs app, and right now we're going to be quantitatively measuring its accuracy by placing a magnet with a known rating and seeing how the different lines change. So on the X-axis we have time, so there's constantly values being picked up. And there's values right now, even though there's not magnets in the immediate vicinity because of the Earth's magnetic field, which is naturally going to create some default values. However, they should be comparatively extremely small to the magnets we're going to be putting up next to them, just because of the extreme distance between these magnets and the iron core of the Earth. So, what we do see is on the X-axis time, on the Y-axis, we're going to have the magnetic field measured in microteslas. So I know that the magnet I have right now is rated at 1.3 kilogauss, and if we were to convert between kilogauss and microteslas, we should receive about 130,000 microtesla when we put the magnet near the phone. So we'll see if that occurs. Let me take out my magnet. And as I place it near the phone, we do start to see a pretty big spike on all these lines, or drop, just depends on how we do it. So if I place it right on top, I'm going to have to shift it around because I'm not exactly sure where this magnetometer is. Now just looking at these values at the bottom, I'm seeing highest I saw was about 5,000 there for the X. So as we can see, we're really not getting that 130,000 that we would expect based on the rating of this magnet. So why is that the case? So from what I know from phone magnetometers is they're mainly just used to measure the Earth's magnetic field, and it cannot give very accurate readings for comparatively really high relative strength magnets. I'm saying relative strength because obviously the iron core of the Earth is a lot higher, has a lot more powerful magnetic field, just the distance in this case. So it seems to max out at around 5 microtesla, which is a pretty valuable insight to have into the accuracy and precision that we are able to achieve with the magnetometer app on the physics lab application. So for our qualitative analysis, I have a few disk magnets, which I'm going to place one at a time onto my phone. So we should see slight changes in the values that are being picked up as I place each value on, just to exemplify the fact that with these small magnets that are not very powerful, it is able to detect a change because we're not really going too high in terms of the kilogauss. The kilogausses that we're presenting with these magnets. So there we go. We can see pretty obviously that there were changes when we add magnets one at a time, so that's our qualitative analysis. So to review the Physics Labs app, I'm going to be reviewing the magnetometer and accelerometer features, so that's what I'm going to be talking about here. So just general information about the app and what I'd review it. For pros, I'd say it had auto-scaling graphs, which was a pretty helpful feature. Just for multiple reasons, but it allowed you to pretty easily see your data and visualize it without having to rescale it, which could be troublesome if you're holding your phone and you're also like using your experimental objects at the exact same time. It had a description of features, so for every single application it had in the app, for like accelerometer, it would have an information section which gave a description of the features and how they worked and what they were measuring and what the purpose of them were, which I thought was useful. You could also press a button to record data points, so I'll show that in a second. I did have some issues with that, which I'll explain in a second, but overall I thought this was a pretty useful feature. It labeled its units, which I thought was extremely helpful in just knowing what you're actually measuring, because of course you could be measuring in inches and meters and years. It really isn't that helpful to get data points without knowing what they're measured in. Airplane mode disables ads, which I thought was extremely helpful because advertisements I just could not deal with while using the app. However, I will get into that when I talk about cons. Frequent ads. If you did not turn off airplane mode, which you might not want to do for a variety of reasons. First off, it's just kind of annoying, but let's say you were expecting some type of file upload, you just could not use the app while with the frequent ads. Very annoying. In my opinion, too frequent, and really disrupted the user experience significantly. Saving to Excel, not explained / functional. So this, in a very important feature of the app, in my opinion, was just very not well explained. And when you ended the recording and saved the data points to the Excel file, it communicated to you that that was happening, but it never communicated where it was. So I checked all around my phone. I checked in files, I checked in photos, I checked in every single place I could think of, and I could not find where it was saving these Excel files. And I thought that was just pretty poorly explained, or not functional. You also couldn't manually scale the graphs, which, although I appreciated the auto-scaling, I would have appreciated this feature a lot too, just especially because, for example, when you turn off the gravity switch, which I'll explain when I get to that section, basically you would see a lot of fluctuations in the scaling of your graph, and it was pretty annoying when you couldn't focus in on smaller parts that were happening more recently in the time frame, as opposed to long scale changes. So for example, you might have a change which gets back to all of your data points being in this type of range, but before that you had them all at numbers like, I don't know, 8 or 6, and you would not be able to see these discrepancies whatsoever. So I thought, although I liked auto-scaling, manual would be great too. And as you can see here, there's a bit of a cluttered y-axis, so the formatting was a bit off. It would be like 0.010, 0.020, it felt like this wasn't supposed to be this way, and it could get kind of cluttered when you had a lot of data points here which weren't fitting inside of the margins. And this is just an example of the advertisements, which I found pretty annoying. They took up a good portion of the screen space that was available. On to the magnetometer. Pros, it was very sensitive. It was able to detect very small changes in
Gausses or and even kilogausses. Very responsive UI, everything updated super quickly and in real time, and if I put something near it, it was almost immediately showed up on the graph. Cons, definitely that it was overstimulated by high kilogauss fields. So when I was measuring this with my magnet, it was unable to correctly get the rating of the magnet just because it couldn't deal with anything that was of relatively high strength given the distance. So it seemed like it was only really useful if you were measuring the magnetic field of the Earth, which wasn't very well explained in the information section, as I wrote here. And it's also if you're using your phone, it doesn't seem like you'd be measuring the magnetic field of the Earth, so it wasn't that useful for the use case which I assumed it to be, and didn't really state the fact that it was only really going to be useful for very minute changes, just relative to the ambient. And like I said, this caused it to incorrectly measure the rating of the 1.3 Gauss magnet, and quite significantly. I'm pretty sure it said about 5 microteslas when it was supposed to be 100, or around 5,000 microteslas when it was supposed to be 130,000. So really couldn't go above that 5 microtesla sensitivity, which was pretty annoying. But it did qualitatively work for our smaller disk magnets. So now onto the accelerometer. What I really liked was that toggleable gravity. Having gravity on all the time would be really annoying, given the fact that it often outweighs a lot of the other features, because the value of 9.8 is going to be a lot more than what you're going to see due to other accelerations. Just from like moving around, a lot of the time 9.8 is just going to auto scale the graph, and because the graphs can't manual scale, it really make it hard to see your measurements. Very responsive graph, like I said, with the magnetometer. Everything updated in real time, and you could move your phone and almost immediately see that change reflected on the graph, and I thought that was pretty helpful in just understanding how it worked and getting a sense for how the second derivative worked. It shows the maximum value for the time interval, so I thought this was an extremely useful feature, especially for the accelerometer. Less so for the magnetometer, just because if you place the magnet down, you weren't really going to see your readings change, but because the accelerometer is changing with time, and it's a time variable, you couldn't really, you couldn't, stop your acceleration and measure it, so the fact that the auto-scaling graph would show you the maximum value during the interval was pretty helpful, and especially the fact that since the interval wasn't that long, you were able to quickly find what that value was. But it would have been a lot better if you had the recording software and you could actually do much more data analysis on that, which brings me to the point that the x and y values axes were not clearly communicated, so the z-axis was pretty clearly vertical. That was obvious just because the toggleable gravity dealt with the z-line, but the x and y, I mean, you could assume that it was some horizontal axis, never communicated if it was north, south, east, west, whatever. So a lot of the time I would walk one direction, I'd get both x and y accelerations, and it was very hard to isolate one and find out which I'm actually dealing with. So that was pretty annoying. Including gravity is default, so with the toggleable gravity was on my default, which like I said was pretty annoying just because it would outshine everything else that the accelerometer was measuring. Especially cluttered y-axis, so I talked about this in general, but specifically for the accelerometer, for some reason, it had a very hard time formatting it correctly, and this made it pretty hard to read, especially because you had to read it very quickly due to the short time period for you to pick up information because it couldn't record. And also, I think the recording was just an even bigger issue for this, because a lot of the accelerometer's features that would be useful is using the accelerometer to maybe calculate integrals and, double integrals, so you're able to see how time and velocity is changing, but you really couldn't do the type of data analysis because you couldn't get the data from the Excel sheet. So overall, I'd give this app 2 out of 5 stars. I thought it was pretty poorly made. A lot of the design choices weren't clearly thought out. It seemed pretty slapped together. If the recording feature worked, I think that would increase my rating probably another star. That was a crucial feature, which just made it pretty difficult to find any use out of the measuring systems. It was functional, at least for the accelerometer, definitely worked. In the magnetometer, if you used small kilogauss objects, it did detect you, at least qualitatively it worked with that. But overall, I wouldn't recommend this app, and there's probably much better tools that you can use to measure with precision.